Ephesians 2 verses 1 to 3. Also you, being dead in the trespasses and sins, in which once you did walk according to the age of the world, according to the ruler of the authority of the air, of the spirit that now is working in the sons of disobedience, among whom also you did walk once in the desires of your flesh, doing the wishes of the flesh and of the thoughts, and were by nature the children of wrath, as also the others. Now this is an amazing passage at what Paul is getting at. We would think of this many times as unnecessary information. But what Paul is doing is that he is explaining what chapter 1 said when he wrote to the Ephesians, and he said to them that Jesus had power over principalities. He had power over darkness, over the rulers of this age. And as we read chapter 2, we understand what this actually is. In order to understand this, we will also have to look at Romans 7 and Romans 8, where Paul comes and explains that that when a person wants to find life by the works of the flesh, that he doesn't have life. That the more you try to obey the law, the less you find it works. Where Paul tries to explain that which actually rules in this world is man trying to find and preserve his life by his own works. That is the spirit and the darkness of this world, which entered this world through Satan in getting Adam and Eve to obey his logic, to obey his wisdom. And what he is coming to do here in chapter 2 is, he is saying that all of the other religions, all of man's effort, and we need to understand that Paul is not attacking other beliefs here. What he is doing here is, he's not even trying to establish a new religious group. He's trying to declare a truth about humanity in Jesus Christ and a victory that came for all people. That is what he's busy with. And what he's explaining is that the Ephesian people does show forth a fruit that is amazing. So what he's doing here is, he says that you were dead in your trespasses and sins, and the death that you were in your trespasses and in your sins was to walk according to a logic that causes the flesh to stand up and manifest in you. And what was that? What do we know that to be? According to Galatians, it's clear that the fruit of the flesh is to try and be legalistic, to try and find rules and regulations wherein we serve God by a system wherein we, through our obedience, try and preserve our lives. And even if we think that the God will preserve our lives if we obey all those laws, at the end of the day, it's all about our own ability, our own works. And what Paul comes and what he does, and he cleverly does this, he comes and he says that the prince of the power of the air, and this is so beautiful in how he explains this in verse 2. It says, in which you did walk according to the age of this world, or according to this world's age. Not how old the earth is, but in this dispensation, the dispensation of death, sin and death that Adam brought in. He says, according to the rule of the authority of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience, among whom we also did walk once in the desires of our flesh. Now, very important, when we find verse 3 here, Paul is now already hinting towards the same thing is true for the Jews. So what he's saying is we walked, and he used the word we there in verse 3, and what he's saying is, you Gentiles walked according to the power of the air, but we also walked according to the power of the air. We also walked according to the authority that there is in the earth, the the kingdom of this worldly system. We also walked according to that. So you Gentiles, you walked according to that, and we also walked according to that. Now that would be an amazing thing for the Gentiles, because the Jews, in their eyes, were God's blue-eyed boys. They were thinking they're the special people of God, and that they are not sinners, that there's no shortcoming with them. But what he's doing here is, what Paul is doing is, he's showing to them, to the Gentiles, that you Gentiles walked under this power, but we Jews, we also walked under this power. And this is how this power works. Once you are under it, it brings forth the lusts of the flesh, and by nature you are children of wrath. Now let me just quickly explain that, children of wrath. When God came in and warned Adam and Eve, he said to Adam and Eve, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for the day you eat thereof you will surely die. That is the wrath of God. It shows that what God was actually saying is if this is what you want, that is what you will have. That word wrath there also means passion, God's passion, God, that which drives God. Now, I do have a wonderful teaching on that on my website, dynamicministries.com, that you can just go and check out. Just go into the search bar at the bottom of the page, of the landing page, and then you will can just put in the wrath of God and find a wonderful explanation on that. Now, I don't have time to explain all of that here now, but we need to understand that the wrath of God is not God coming in a fit of rage, killing people, but that the wrath of God is actually to give people over to what they really want. And what God was saying is that the consequences of eating of this tree is death. And what Paul is doing here is he's saying to the Ephesians that you were under this power, we were under this power of the air, this power of death, and as we try to implement our own ability, our own nature, we find that from this nature, what was born in us was death. That is what he's saying there. So he comes and he says that they were dead in their trespasses and sins. Very important in verse 1. So they're dead in their trespasses and sins. Why does he call them dead? Because who they are could not show. Who they are could not show, could not come forth, and that death would be unto eternal death. And then he comes and explains why it is, and he says because you're walking according to a certain logic. And then he comes and he says that logic was not just what you walked under, but what we as Jews also walked under. And we would see how Paul cleverly lays this, and then how he would later on get into the law and explain that the law is actually that which brings separation and death, since we by our own power are trying to obey the law, which we cannot do. Now let me just read this from the Resurrection Bible, Ephesians 2 verse 1. He has the rule over all, be it Jew or Gentile. Now the reason why I put this in there, verse 2, and I just put Jew and Gentile, although it is not in the original, it doesn't point to Jew and Gentile. It's simply because of the context found in verse 3, where he is saying that you Gentiles were actually dead, but then he comes in verse 3, says, amongst also whom all did walk. We all did walk. So he was saying, listen, man, we as Jews also walked under this. So I just used that liberty, and that's the nice thing about a paraphrase. You can just bring the whole context into any verse to explain just what is being said. He has the rule over all, be it Jew or Gentile. This is now Jesus. This is proven by him ruling over the death in you Gentiles by bringing forth his intended life in you, the wonderful life of his Spirit you now experience. So what Paul is what he's showing the Gentiles here is that the way wherein Jesus will rule over sin and death is by bringing forth a brand new life. And he draws upon the experience that these Gentiles had, and he says, listen, can you see that you are also now under the kingdom? That's what he's trying to say. Can you see that you are also now partakers of this new rule? Because how did you get it right after that you believed to all of a sudden love and be kind and good and have the fruit of the Spirit, as said in chapter 1, wherein they were sealed by the Holy Spirit by loving all the saints having a love for Jew or Gentile. He says, where does that come from? It comes from God that is now ruling over your sin and death. And what Paul is coming to do here is he is explaining to them how the power of God works, and in the back of his mind protecting them against the Judaizers that he knows would come their way. And he goes on and he says in verse 2, just as the Jews, you Gentiles in Ephesus, were completely given over and in bondage to the core principles that manifested death in humans. Now we know that the law is the power of sin, and the wages of sin is death. Now there's a lot to say about that, but he's referring to the prince of the power of this air, which is self-preservation by your own works. Right. The death system is still at work and brings forth bad fruit in those that are in unbelief of his original plan. Here we see Paul comes again and he just builds on what he said in chapter 1, wherein he says that Jesus did everything, but as we are persuaded of this and believe this, we find that that truth actually manifests in us. Their unbelief in the truth is the opportunity death gladly uses to destroy them. Then I'm going to end off by reading verse 3. We as Jews were not excluded from sin's death blow. We were as much given over to the bondage to death as you were. The fact that we were given the law code did not save us from death. As a matter of fact, we were worse off. Our minds and the desires of the flesh were running wild, manifesting sins in all forms and lusts. Jews and Gentiles were both in the same sinking boat and in need of a life saver.